Good morning. Olivia, welcome to IP Voices, the international interview series highlighting IP leaders behind brands and innovation. So I'm so pleased to have you today and have a chance to converse with you about your career and work. And before we start, let me just briefly introduce you to our audience who will get to know you better in a minute. You're an IP lawyer and thought leader with about 20 years experience in this field. You first started your career at Clifford Chance in Paris, and then you spent 17 years in-house at Richemont, the luxury fashion group in Geneva. And more recently, you have created your own firm, OutBoxing IP, which is offering tailored in-house IP services à la carte. I love that description, which I think suits you very well.
It's a little nicer than fractional IP.
I totally agree. À la carte sounds amazing. And in addition to your legal expertise, you are a prolific writer. You are a freelance writer for the Journal du Luxe, and you also have recently published a book called Luxury in Court, where you take the reader via Alice, who is a fictional IP counsel, through some of the most important IP issues for luxury brands. And you also illustrate what it takes, I think, to be a creative lawyer and effective business partner through the trials and tribulations of Alice in her world of IP and luxury. And last but not least, you are moonlighting, as I think you put it, as an upcycling artist creating witty pieces of art from used fabrics, which we will try to highlight a little bit here on this podcast so people have a chance to also discover your artistic nature. Let's start with a question I've been dying to ask you in relation to the book that you published recently. Are you Alice? And if not, then how did you come up with this fairy tale concept?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Sherazad. It's an honor, and thank you for the very flattering introduction. Alice, am I Alice? No, I am not Alice. I couldn't possibly be Alice, because Alice describes, as you say, the major cases that have touched on the luxury industry and that have touched many maisons that I have never worked for. So no, I'm not Alice. I couldn't be Alice because it's a satire. It's a tender satire as well as it is an IP or legal book. And I needed that little distance through a character. Now, what was that character going to look like? Initially, I had a sort of generic IP counsel, but that didn't work at all. And Alice came up quite naturally because as I was writing, typically the case of Jean-Charles de Castelbajac, where you have the problem of the fashion name that is sold and then the soul of the fashion brand that is lost, I immediately thought of the Cheshire Cat, the cat without a grin and the grin without a cat. And so that inspired me to write Alice as the main character who enters the wonderland of luxury. And the princesses, well, it's something that very naturally came to me during my long years working for luxury brands. Is how, they're very capricious, they're very arrogant, they're very sophisticated, they're all of those things, and they're very vulnerable. You want to look after them. So that's how the notion came.
That's wonderful. Very, very clever. So please now, because I introduced you briefly, but please tell us more about the brands and innovation that you've supported throughout your career.
Perhaps before diving into the world of Richemont, I think it's important to say that, yes, there were 8 years in private practice where I wasn't working for the luxury industry at all. I was working for plain industry manufacturers. I was working for mammary implants. I was working for Playboy. So very, very diverse clientele and doing a lot of patent litigation. Why do I say this? Is because I have so many students who kind of write to me saying, I want to do luxury law. I want to do fashion law. And I tell them, you're already doing a specialization. Don't over specialize. First, learn your profession. And that starts elsewhere. And then by chance, I entered the world of Richemont. It was a chance. It was also a huge privilege because I have always loved the history of art. I've always, done some artistic work, and being able to combine my interest for art and history to IP, I couldn't have been better kind of placed than at Richemont, because every single case forced us to go back to 200 years of design.
Yeah.
The Bauhaus, the Art Deco, all these things, you just dive into every single case. So that was how I started at Richemont. What was wonderful also was working for so many maisons. Very often when you're in-house, you are working for one maison. You are depending on the CEO of the maison. You have a subordinate role. At Richemont, we were very lucky to be centralized. And so we had that distance, almost the authority of being Richemont headquarters vis-a-vis the maisons, and a certain independence that you can have when you're a private practice lawyer. We were also very close to the maisons, and 26 maisons of very different profiles. Some, German culture, Italian culture, French culture, American culture in the latest acquisitions, and with very different business models, sizes, budgets. So everything was tailored, and the wealth of experience that we were able to accumulate with all those maisons was incredible.
What was the catalyst of you entering IP when you chose to join Clifford Chance early on? I mean, obviously, you hinted to the fact that you're very creative, you love art, you love that world, but was it the inspiration initially?
Yeah, I mean, I had no idea why I was going to do law initially. It was really, there was no more time. I'd tried other things. It was September, so I signed up to the Law University in Paris. I had no idea what I was doing. It so happened I wasn't too bad at it, but it's never been a vocation as such. It's just I was doing it and doing it not too badly. When it came to specializing, by that time I had learned to enjoy the law. And there's one area of the law which is fantastic, which is international private law, because it's such a chess game. It's just lots of fun. So I was hesitating between that specialization and IP. I did go to IP because I loved art, literature, and I thought, oh, I'm going to work with artists. Before joining Clifford Chance, I actually did 2 years in a very niche firm that was very specialized in IP applied to literature and press law. I'm actually writing a prequel to Alice, which talks about private practice. But there I did get to meet writers that I had very much admired. And I realized that sometimes you don't want to meet the authors that you have admired because they're not as sweet as or lovely as their books. When I left the niche firm for Clifford Chance, there I was leaving the artistic world completely. I was diving into the industrial world, very big companies and patent litigation, which, I had no vocation to do when I was studying IP, but which I, again, discovered and very much enjoyed working with engineers. And that actually served me enormously when I arrived at Richemont, because when I arrived at Richemont, Cartier was just creating its horlogerie activities. And under Bernard Fornes, they would do a concept watch every year. And when I arrived, we had to set up the whole R&D, let's say, activity. And later that was centralized at Richemont, where, again, I was very involved in setting that up. And having the patent background was extremely useful. So it's not all soft IP and luxury.
I would like to know, what do you find the most rewarding about operating at the intersection of creativity, business, and law?
Very good question. Because, so in private practice, obviously I was working with clients in different fields who were in the realm of obviously innovation, because IP is necessarily putting you in contact with innovation. The big difference is that in private practice, you essentially work with lawyers, in-house lawyers, judges, other lawyers. You're in a world where everybody thinks the same because they have the same mental structure. They've all gone to the same universities. So there's something very easy and comfortable in that. When you go into a business, all of a sudden you're kind of at the intersection of engineers, marketing, communication, business decision makers, executives, finance, real estate, you name it. And all of these people have come from very different backgrounds, designers, obviously. And they all come from different backgrounds. They have different motivations. They have different mental wirings. And you have to adjust to each. You have to make them understand what you do in order to get them to adhere and participate and be actors of that. I suppose in-house, you are part of the project. You're not just advising on the side with, the rules as they are with the 50% chance. No, you are going in there with 30% chance of success. You know it, but you're going to go and fight it because you believe in it and you want to be beside your team. So that's what I've really enjoyed being in the business, is being, with very many different people and seeing in the business how all these different people, it's kind of a miracle that they managed to do something, and they do.
Yes. Yeah, it's incredible. And actually, having worked with these teams and now having created your own firm and having published your own book and writing your articles, did working with these teams further shaped your leadership style and also your influence, your professional and personal identity?
I think the way I worked with them definitely did. And I'm the sort of person who has about 150 ideas in a day, which is not necessarily a good thing because it can be a bit tiring for people. But of the 150, obviously only one or two are useful, but there's still one or two a day. That's a lot. And I definitely was innovative in the way I managed, the tools that I introduced along the way. I was interested in technology. I'm anything but a geek, but for some reasons, I've had this geek imposter sort of facade where people think I'm a geek. I'm not. I'm just interested in how technology can answer a need. And typically when I discovered blockchain through a young startup and the applications that were possible to date creations going back much further in the creative process, it filled the gap. And I thought, well, yes, of course we have to try. And try we did. And thanks to COVID, actually, we were able to upscale immediately because we couldn't have our bailiffs stamp the creations anymore. So without COVID, the change management would have been more difficult.
Funny you should say that, because this is my impression also of you initially, because we met at a conference where you were speaking about blockchain. So I actually thought you were definitely a bit more, geeky for sure for an IP lawyer.
It's quite funny. It's quite funny. But the trick every time was to find a kind of champion within the business who knew his stuff.
Yeah.
And would actually support the project. So there's a lot of that also that goes on with the innovation, is often with the people who have many, many ideas at this, but you have a tendency to have ideas and inventions or things that people aren't quite ready for yet. And you realize in doing that innovation is a lot about timing, having the right time. If you're too early, you're too early. If you're too late, you're too late. And let's say playing with innovation yourself helps you to be much more relevant in your discussions with innovators, I find, because you relate to them, you empathize, you've tried it, you've done it, you've seen what it does. And so you can better, I think, interact and understand.
So does it mean that today, because you've been practicing, you've been experiencing, you've been testing, you have a better ability to speak to innovators, you think, or were you referring to your experience in-house?
I think both.
Both?
I mean,
Okay.
I learned a lot, both at Clifford Chance, in-house, and today. You keep learning all the time because, again, they're very different. When you're working at Clifford Chance, they're very big companies and you're supporting a type of innovation process. Then when you're in-house, we had different types of innovation processes because the sizes and the business models were different. And then when you come out, we were talking about it, you realize there's a whole world out there beyond your princesses.
Yes.
Where they're baby princesses, and these are wild princesses who are taking risks every day, and you want to help them out. You want to help them secure a minimum of the foundations of what they're investing in.
Absolutely. So now we're going to pivot a bit to, what does it take to actually be a creative business partner? There was a a passage in your book, I think, which was quite interesting, page 33, where the CEO says to the head of IP, clearly you have trained this young lawyer to think. And that is what I need. New generations of thinkers who can learn from my trusted and experienced experts and bring with them fresh ideas, even if not quite finished. And that's where I need you. So I wondered if you could maybe comment on what do you think, based on your experience in the law firm, in-house, and now, in your own firm, what does it take to be a creative business partners? And can one be trained to become creative? And is it just about really thinking?
It's a really good question, but I think underlying in there's the notion that our creativity will die if we don't nurture it. And only young people can nurture by challenging, by bringing new things. And I'd say all the more with the speed of technology, young generations teach us constantly. And this is something that I've been very keen on doing throughout my career. At Clifford Chance, I looked after the trainees. Then when I came in-house, one thing that really struck me was these trainees were accumulating internships upon internships. They couldn't get their first job. And I found that really unfair. And at one point in the context of our team, assistants kind of moved on to more prestigious jobs. And we had these headcounts. Were we going to take on assistants or some different profile? And I imagined these roles of junior lawyers who would come in, baby lawyers, fresh from university, that was the rule. And I would tell them, look, I'm not giving you a strict timeline. Stay with us, train, teach us, and then leave for your second job. Because it's always that 3 to 5 years of experience. It's being asked, where are they supposed to find the 3 years? And we had, I think, 5 generations of junior lawyers. It was good. It was challenging for the team because every time you had to retrain, for sure. But I'm also convinced, my children went to Montessori schools, that part of keeping your skill alive is also training. If you can train, that means that you master your art. And the more you train, the more you learn. And these young kids also come from university. They're kind of like a river of fresh water that keeps us fresh. They don't stay so long that they get entrenched in the golden cage. And so they kept us alive in many ways. And I think youth sparks creativity in older people as well.
Yes.
And I think we need to have that constant exchange.
It'd be interesting to get also your thought about, to be more creative in IP, it's so important to be also exposed to different, subject matter within IP without necessarily being, focused on maybe trademark clearance, trademark enforcement, maybe get into blockchain like you did, embracing new digital, media, understand the, how we can best, work with these new tools and not necessarily just focus in one area. Can you just comment on the importance of that really variety of experience to become maybe more creative in our field?
So when I arrived at Richemont, the structure was, let's say, adapted to a smaller group, and with some people who had more the trademark agent profile, were doing the filings, were doing the clearance, this sort of thing. You had some who were doing more the contracts and some who were more in litigation and anti-counterfeiting, which had its logic. But as the group grew, it became more difficult. And my boss and I both had the same idea that we were already specialized lawyers, and over specializing just kind of limited our creativity as lawyers and also our efficiency, because obviously if you just do filings, you don't really know how they're enforced. And if you enforce, you don't really know how the filing process happens. And so we decided to create these wonderful roles, because from time to time I stepped in when someone was absent, and I loved their jobs, which was basically, from birth to grave, you are in charge of 1, 2, 3 missiles, depending on the side. You negotiate the budget, you do the filings, you help on the projects, you do the contracts, you manage the litigations. You have the whole vision. And it's super rewarding because you're in charge, you have the visibility, you have the vision, and you're working with the CEOs, the CFOs, the operational teams. So that's brilliant. I would say another thing in terms of nurturing creativity, we had two wonderful initiatives at Richemont twice, which were open innovation contests, open to all the employees. You could submit ideas. The second one, there were themes. The first one, not necessarily. But there were hundreds and hundreds of amazing ideas that came into that pot. And well, obviously I participated. We were only allowed 2 at first. I kept calling, can I do another one? I was given a blank check at the end of the day because they were bored. And so obviously not all the lawyers wanted to contribute or participate because not everybody has that. But I did tell them, I want you to look at all the contributions because what you're seeing there is a window into the future of the cases you will be managing as IP lawyers. And it's true. I'm seeing them come out often 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, which shows that there were a lot of forward-thinking people. But that was a really, really insightful operation. I thought it was good.
Sounds super interesting. So now we will pivot to the international nature of our field, because this is one thing I love about, IP law and the IP bar, is that it's super international. And I wonder, obviously, you also lived in different countries, and how, has working globally shaped your worldview? And maybe, if you can provide us with some tips about, collaborating effectively across cultures.
On my background, basically, I grew up with 2 cultures, which were French and English. I learned, well, my mother tongue was French, but I learned to read in English. Hence all the references to nursery rhymes and children's books. This is very anchored in those. I mean, it seems old-fashioned after Brexit, but I'm fundamentally a European. I see myself as European. And my daughter actually right now is doing Erasmus, where she's with Greek kids. I mean, it's just wonderful. I think it's a beautiful idea, even if it has its flaws. And when I was at Clifford Chance, yes, I was exposed to international cases, multi-jurisdictional, where you get to work with different cultures. And I remember one case was with a Japanese company, and everyone had warned me, they are misogynistic. They don't like working with women. You look like you're 13 and a half. They won't respect you. So I was a bit more. And we developed the most wonderful relationship because there were the younger ones, the older ones. They always came as a group. It was quite formal. I learned that Japanese clients would ask the same question 10 times to check if the answer was the same, because the question would be framed a little differently. I had my partner who was completely hysterical because he couldn't stand the length that it took, the time. But I really admired the precision. And where I became very friendly with one of them was he asked me I was going to a hearing, procedural hearing. And I came back and he says, so how did it go? And I said, oh, well, basically the judge cut the baby in 2. And I hear a very nervous laugh. Ha ha ha, what do you mean? I cut the baby in 2. So I tell him the story about the King Solomon and the baby, etc. And he loved it. And then he started telling me some of his stories from Japanese culture. And it was the beginning of a really good client relationship. So I believe in stories as bridges a lot. And I think it requires a bit of humility, watching, looking, and being interested in the culture. China, I didn't go to that many times. But the 1 or 2 times that I went there, I discovered, works of literature that are extraordinary, that we know nothing about. The Story of the Stone, or The Story of the Red Chamber, as it's called, is a 6-volume novel with about 300 characters, which tells the story of an adolescent. And it is his adolescence. And that adolescence from the 18th century is exactly the same as our teenage boys today. And it's written like a Netflix series. There are cliffhangers. And when you've read that, you then interact with the Chinese people who have a tradition of exchanging, saying, well, who's your favorite character? And the choice of the character is always very telling. They're horrified when I tell them what my favorite character is. because she's a very dominant, seductive woman who's quite nasty. But you discover throughout the book that she actually suffers terribly because she has miscarriage after miscarriage, and she's never able to have a baby. And again, these are topics that are taboo in our
Yeah.
cultures. And this book is amazing. So stories are always an amazing bridge into
Yeah.
client relationships, and
Yeah.
I think taking the time is always good.
That's a great point. Storytelling and stories. But what's interesting too is I need to look into that book
Amazing.
because it's an interesting way to relate to each other without having to really speak some hard truth or hard topics. And then you can
Exactly.
maybe connect maybe a bit, in a implied way. So that's very interesting. And also, in your luxury in court, I was a comment that Alice makes about China being one of the most creative jurisdictions
Yes.
in IP. So I thought it was very interesting note as well.
Often people are surprised, but I mean, the sophistication of the courts and the court systems, I mean, those specialized internet courts, we have nothing like them. They've been using blockchain as evidence since 2012. They
Yeah,
are a far cry ahead of us in many
yeah,
ways now.
yeah, yeah. And so I think that's why also IP is wonderful because you are able, thanks to your cases, to discover truly how countries and legal system work, and it really gives you a great insight in the
Yeah, it
in
does.
culture, right? And
Yeah.
opens your eyes to
It does.
the
And I would say
possibilities.
in-house, it's even stronger because when you are a French lawyer, you will be working on multi-jurisdictionals, working with other lawyers, have clients elsewhere, but you're doing French law and you're a specialist in French law. When you come in-house, you lose the technicity of your French law. You become a mechanic of the law. But then when you start devising your strategy, you're in charge. You go and get your lawyers here and there. You learn that you can do little tricks and tips over there and over here, and you strategize, and that's very rewarding as well. You do much
Yes.
more comparative law at the end of the day.
Exactly. And I love that aspect as well. Absolutely. That's definitely one of my favorite part of working globally in a company. We're going to move to another question. It's about an IP challenge. Can you share an IP challenge where you had to be exceptionally creative?
I think the story of the raccoon in the
I
book
love that one.
is telling. So it wasn't a
Yes.
raccoon; it was a
Yes.
panther, as people will have worked out. The story is that Cartier was working on an institutional, beautiful film that lasted at least 5 minutes, called L'Odyssée de Cartier, which you can find on internet. Literally a week before the launch, an Yves Saint Laurent perfume ad came out, with Emily Blunt in an apartment seeing a panther, stroking the panther. That last scene was practically the same as the last scene of the Cartier film, with a lady stroking the panther. So naturally, the CEO was hysterical. He was like, do something. We'll look into it, but, a living panther that's kind of passing by the screen for 5 minutes, we'll look into it. And he's like, no, you're going to do something. I was like, okay. So these CEOs are also the ones who push us to our limits,
Yes.
because you have no choice. You have to do something and you want to do it well. So obviously no trademarks, no copyright on a panther. We were never able to prove that there was a leak or something, untoward. So we went for what you go for when you have no other choice, which is parasitic behavior. And I have to say that when we went to the courtroom and our lawyer, with his flourishing sleeves, started to tell the story of the panther to 3 judges who had little glasses, moccasins, and unkempt hair, I thought, this is never going to fly. This is just not going to work. And he did an amazing job of telling the story of the panther with Louis Cartier, Jeanne Toussaint, how it had gone
Hmm.
on for 100 years, how there were these iconic photos of the panther visiting the 13 Rue de la Paix, which is the flagship store of Cartier. And we ended up in getting an amazing decision before the Court of Appeal, where L'Oréal was ordered to pay €1 million.
Wow.
And it's since become a real reference, a very, very useful precedent, because every
Yes.
time there's a lion cub, a
Mm-hmm.
guépard, a
Yeah.
panther, a leopard, we have the judgment.
Yeah. Yes. And again, I think it shows the power of storytelling, would you say? Because
Yes,
it's super
completely.
important, right? And the lawyers really embrace that. And then,
That's all we had was a
yes, yes,
story, you
story.
know?
Very powerful. Yes. Excellent, excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Can you share a moment from your career that illustrates best the real world impact of protecting an idea, a brand, creative work? Something that really had a, impact on you, but also a real impact on, on the world.
Do you know, I mean, I would say on the world, gosh.
When I say the world, I mean like, in the end consumers, and because, our work often is, we don't necessarily always see the direct impact of
Yeah,
our work. And so that's
yeah.
really what the question is trying to get at, is because we
Mm,
work so upstream sometimes. Of course,
mhm.
enforcement is a different one when we
Yeah.
actually have a court case, but sometimes court cases can take years. But
Mm,
have you worked on something where you've seen, oh wow, I see the result of my work or the result of the team's work, and
yeah,
it had a real impact on
yeah. I mean, I
people?
think as always, IP sits within many efforts to preserve the exclusivity of something that's really precious to a maison. And I'm going to take because it's an easy example, the love bracelet by Cartier. So created by Aldo Cipollone in 1968, actually something that was very different to the Cartier style at the time, and which was obviously very, very successful. I take no credit for this. It was my prior boss who had the genius at the
Hmm.
time to file a 3D trademark on the screw device. So at the time, nobody understood what a 3D mark was, so it passed in many jurisdictions. But that has become a super precious asset in enforcing globally,
Hmm.
a bit online. It's a very, very powerful tool, which we defended all these years throughout the jurisdictions, which was recognized by the Cour de Cassation as a
Hmm.
valid trademark. So there was the timing, because today I think it would be practically impossible to obtain 3D trademarks because the trademark offices are much more difficult. But there was the foresight, the rolling out, the
Hmm.
enforcement, and yeah, the impact is huge because it's one of those iconic jewels that play an important part in the turnover and the success of a maison.
Yes.
I mean, similarly, the Alhambra, well, that's a whole whole other story in defending the Alhambra, perhaps much more challenging, but it's the same principle. So it's not only IP that will give
Hmm.
the exclusivity and the success, but the IP helps to frame, helps to protect all the investments that are
Yes.
made to drive this success.
Yes, absolutely. And on this, actually, there's an interesting passage in your book that says all intangible assets are worth exploring and valorizing through creative thinking. And once you have transformed the creative thinking into something formal, your IP protection is born. And it's kind of magic, really. So I think it speaks to what you just said.
I think it applies to so many
Yes.
situations that we are sort of confronted with as IP lawyers, and
Yes,
that's what makes our field so exciting and fun.
absolutely. I totally agree. What has been your toughest challenge as an IP lawyer, and what did it teach you about your work? Maybe also yourself.
I think what was the most challenging was discovering managing a team, because you have so many different things to consider. I
Hmm.
had a team of 24 people. And so you obviously, for the business, you need them to perform. For them, you want to develop their skills. You don't want them to get bored. You don't want them to
Hmm.
stagnate. You don't want and out of respect for their intellect and who they are and their capacities, you want them to do their best. You have to deal with frustrations. You have to deal with so many things that are human that we have no training for as lawyers. So it's really the on the job and discovering what works, what doesn't work, and what mistakes you make.
Hmm.
An example is one of the things that I was starting to see was once people were on their maisons, was they were going to be there for 30 years. How would I keep them challenged, stimulated? Well, and obviously in-house, you don't really have much verticality space to make people grow. But horizontally, because we were lucky to be at the headquarters, there was so much to explore. And so I proposed that we change the portfolios of the maisons regularly. And what I learned was this, is that when I presented the project, everyone adhered intellectually. They were like, this is a great idea. When it came to the crux of actually saying, okay, you're going to go here, you're going to go there, and explaining why it would be good for them, there was a total meltdown. So it was great as long as it wasn't the person.
Implemented.
It was right. It had to be someone else, and that was great. And it was difficult. But then you learned from that little by little, and you learned that it's not about getting people intellectually involved. It's getting them emotionally understanding the why. And the why obviously is to upskill, to learn, to discover, which they understood later. But when you come with new ideas like that, sometimes you make mistakes because you haven't necessarily thought all around. Management is really hard. It's really hard to get just right, but it also teaches you so much about yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So now, what's one misconception about our field you would like to correct once for all?
A misconception.
And maybe while you think, I saw two misconceptions I highlighted while I was reading your book that resonated with me.
Okay.
I will quote, if you don't mind. It's page 100. I love that, this passage. It is when conditions are the most stringent that true creativity emerges. And in parentheses, you put, and before you object, yes, a lawyer can be creative. So I think that's one thing I highlighted in Alice's experience as one misconception. And another one on page 166, I believe. I love that one. It's one of my favorite maybe quote of the book. The CEO cut her off, and Alice, I need to think. Draw up a memo with everything you said. I never imagined IP could be a driver for strategy. So for me, these two big, when I read the book, I was like, oh, I highlighted them. I was like, yes, these are misconceptions that I personally, I think I've encountered, throughout my career. Yeah. But please, without being influenced by what I just said, what do you think is one misconception you would love to correct?
Well, I think one of the misconceptions, especially perhaps for less institutional companies, because then it's kind of in the works, is really how useful it is, whether it's useful at all. And, young startups will have a tendency to just grow their business, do the creative stuff, and completely neglect their protection. And so they grow something which is based on foundations of sand. And often they'll get a problem much later down the line, which they could have resolved initially. And it's true that in the kind of fundraising processes of getting funds, getting investors involved, it's very difficult for them to say, I'll carve out so much for my IP. Now, I have a current client who's incredible, who's doing it almost himself. He's very AI supported. He comes to me for the extra tip, but he does a lot himself. And it's in the gaming world. And a big company basically used his name for something. Well, he had all the IP to stop it immediately. And without the IP, he would have been completely helpless.
Yes.
So that's a very good kind of positive example, but not everybody does that.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. What do you think gives a brand real value today? You've worked with all types of brands. So what is your thoughts on that? And how do you think IP shapes that value?
I have perhaps a controversial chapter in Alice called the Pea and the Princess. So obviously the real story is called The Princess and the Pea. And the analogy is about the overimportance that has been given these last years to what we call iconic products. So, they're great. They've brought these maisons to heights that they had never reached up till now. It's quite an easy manner to bring in because you're always sort of doing the same communication. It's kind of so anchored in the mind of people that it is the first purchase. It's kind of entry into the brand, which is fantastic. The difficulty is you can then become over dependent on your icon, and you can start to reduce the radiance of your maison brand. Because if, and I'm not saying this is the case, but if Cartier becomes Love, the Love bracelet, if Hermès becomes the Birkin bag, then all of a sudden you're no longer talking about all the rest of the products. Hermès's scarves that are so signature, we don't hear about the scarves so much. Whereas I recently went to a boutique in Hermès, and the sales lady was showing me all the scarves that have a name. Every scarf has a name. They're designed by artists. We don't hear enough about that. We hear about the Birkin bag.
Yeah.
And so again, this idea that you reduce the power of your brand to one product, I think is dangerous. And you might get a little lazy in the creative process because you're bringing in the money.
Yes.
You know, it's the bread falling from the sky every morning. You don't have to work to make the bread anymore.
Yeah. And I think it applies across the board because it's the same with consumer, goods companies as well.
No
They
doubt.
focus on their best sellers, on their,
Mm,
best
mm,
selling products. Similarly, you would have some other brands that are very powerful regionally, locally, that do
yeah,
get less attention and get
yeah.
sometimes forgotten.
As always, counterfeiters know how to exploit that. That was the
Yes.
origin of dupes.
Yeah.
Because you no longer need to have the trademark Cartier in a dupe love band because it looks like a love bracelet. So it kind of helps, and actually in the world of leather goods, you have the famous work done by Walmart. You have all these pink tea lookalikes that are made in China. Because again, the price is stretched so much, the more iconic it becomes, that clients might feel that they want to do something else and have the same bag, but without the brand, which shows that the brand is no longer important, which is tragic.
Yeah, ironically, the result might not be intended, but yeah, the
Yeah, no,
consequence
no,
is real.
completely.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Now, let me ask you about one thing that you wish more business leaders understood about the IP ecosystem.
That it's intimately tied to the value of the company. The S&P reports now say that the value of companies is 90% made up of intangible assets, whereas previously it was 30%. I mean, that already should make us think. Ironically, on a balance sheet, IP is one line as a cost center. The value of the trademark Cartier doesn't feature on the documents. There again, it's a distortion of the reality. So yes, CEOs need to understand, and we were lucky at Richemont. They were very curious. They were very involved in the IP decision-making process strategy. I mean, we also put in place a kind of constant dialogue. But you also realize that when you do make the effort of explaining, be it to the CEOs or the operational teams, they get curious, they enjoy it, they retain ideas, and then they challenge you. They're like, you said this the other time. You're like, well, it wasn't quite the same situation. So it makes it more fun. But understanding that without IP, you just don't have the exclusivity that you are building. You'll lose it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think more work today is being done around this IP finance to try to bridge that gap because it's true that there is a bit of
Yeah.
the yeah,
There's one thing
yeah,
that for me comes back a lot is the
yeah.
problem of time. We live on different time
So
scales.
yeah.
More and more sort of international companies live
Mm-hmm.
on one time scale, which is
Mm-hmm.
the fiscal year. It's the
Yes.
metronome. We, as well as the creative and innovation teams, are on time scales of 10 years, 20 years, 70 plus years. And sometimes you have to deal with the tension that exists between coming to the end of your fiscal year and giving the dividends to the shareholders and everybody be happy, and investing into those future years.
Long term. Absolutely. this tension exists also in FMCG, and this is exactly that tension: long-term planning and innovation, brand building versus the short-term
Yeah.
innovation to grow your,
And
your share. Yeah,
everything is in the FMT's fast moving. Yeah, it's fast
fast
moving, but it
moving.
has to be imagined before it
Yes,
moves.
absolutely. 200-year-old companies were built
Yeah,
from scratch, and the brand, it got built over
yeah,
hundreds of years, and that's why it's so strong
exactly.
today. And so this is something that, I think definitely business people should always keep in mind, how to continue building for that 100 years, 200 years time frame.
I think, some CEOs definitely have that in mind. They build for
Yes.
the future. Others uh, may be more interested in, doing what they have to do for the next 5 years for their career. And there's also something in the kind of, speed of turnover of CEOs, which isn't always healthy. And I think we need to give the CEOs their full role, because they really play the melody of the brand, their own melody of the brand. They give their touch, and it has to be designed for the future as
Yeah.
well.
They're instrumental in that, absolutely. And that's a big role that they have to actually play
Yeah.
and stay.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier, obviously, for privately held companies versus publicly traded companies, because you have the pressures of the market. But I hope we can strike good balance, a better balance for the future between those short-term, goals and long-term brand building.
Yeah. And just to come back to the question of, how IP has the strategic role, and the misconceptions is sometimes people will see IP lawyers as those who file the rights, who do a bit of
Yes.
enforcement. They don't necessarily see them as lawyers, which we are.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the distinction between legal and IP is often very artificial, because you're having the commercial teams, the distribution agreements, for example. What are distribution agreements if not IP agreements?
Hmm.
Because it's about brand licensing. And I think there would be a lot of value in unsiloing also the relationship between IP teams and legal teams, because they are so intertwined. Every acquisition requires a huge involvement of IP.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's something that we need to work on in terms of
Yeah.
understanding of who we are.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is definitely quite existential for IP lawyers, actually, because you see also a lot of moves from companies where they create these legal commercial teams where IP is embedded, but IP is not necessarily leading necessarily on
Mm,
certain things, where we actually, as IP lawyers, we do have a lot of skills and quite
yeah.
interesting perspective on the innovation
Yeah.
process from A to Z, right?
Yeah. I mean, one example, when I arrived, well, the famous moment when, the innovation team was being built,
Hmm.
there was a glitch in one research contract or project where they'd gone on for quite a while, spent a lot, and then obviously it was who owns what. And obviously the contract didn't address IP. And the reasoning was, oh, but it's a manufacturing supply contract, so there is no IP. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding. And
Yes.
obviously we were able to correct it. But there are quite a lot of, I would say the 99% of the contracts that are concluded, celebrity contracts, all these things. And I believe very much in the kind of co-lead combination of a
Yes.
commercial lawyer, general commercial lawyer who has other skills as well, and the IP lawyers to co-lead as a binôme, as we say in
Yes,
French.
yes, absolutely. And this is definitely something that I think, some companies are taking this route where they're creating more like hybrid teams. But I think this, because of our specialization and the way it has worked, it's not always easy to find, IP lawyers who have that experience, or vice versa,
Yeah,
commercial lawyers who have the right IP expertise. So I think it's the future, I think. And I think for maybe people listening here, if you're looking into entering the IP world, I would definitely recommend to have quite a broad expertise in commercial,
yeah,
maybe contracts and also IP. And then I think it will be a great
yeah.
combination to have. for the
And
future?
I mean, there's one thing I know people weren't necessarily happy when I said that, but IP is not rocket science. You can learn IP on the job. And if you've got a good boss who's technical, you can learn from your boss. If you have the fundamentals of, commercial law, you can do it. And I mean, my bosses in the past were not IP lawyers to start with, but they became IP lawyers. So you don't have to have a
Yes.
diploma in IP law.
Yes. How do you see the world of IP evolving, and what do you see the next big challenge for, maybe for the IP industry, but because you also have the fashion and luxury industry?
I'm not going to talk about AI because I think, that's
Yes,
kind of,
it's the obvious.
yeah, exactly. I think the one which is an almost existential challenge is the second market. So we have the trademarks which give us exclusivity, but obviously the luxury industry has also been built on selective distribution, where you as a brand owner guarantee to your distributor a certain exclusive environment. Now, if your distributor has next door a secondhand store that is selling exactly the same products at a discount because it's secondhand, then you're not going to be happy. You're not going to be wanting to pay the premium. And you as a brand owner can't do anything about it because it's perfectly legal to sell secondhand goods, right? So it really shakes that, for one. Secondly, all the young clients of the future, they're going to the secondhand market. They're not going to so you're losing data, precious data. So, and there's a lot of tension between, the luxury brands and this new market, because the luxury brands don't quite know whether they should enter it, whether they should fight it. Being more conservative, they tend to want to fight before experimenting. There are a lot of things that can be imagined, that should be imagined. I like to direct people to Lego as a really good sandbox. They are like 20 years ahead of us, or the automotive industry. But there are lots of inspirations that could be taken from there. But I think that's a real challenge. And what we're seeing live is also the problem with the fact it's so unregulated that we're starting to see more and more counterfeits that are being pushed as authentic vintage. And we have no tools for that. Now, we can imagine them. So, for example, we could imagine that an AI plugged into the patrimony could identify fake vintages, because the problem is older products people don't recognize or know. And so there's not the speed that's needed to take down. You might have a problem of loss of rights. And then, there's the question of, trademarks only worked once there was a central register. So a trademark is only efficient with a central register. Do we need a kind of second-hand register, official register, to regulate that market, where brands would sort of validate the fact that this person is selling authentic goods? There might be a kind of legal license where, because brands can't control post, but they can validate the authenticity or things like that. I think there's a lot that needs to be imagined with creative lawyers, but we're not quite there yet. But it's a big, big change.
To that point, is the electronic passport, product passport, would that answer that challenge?
Partially because it enables your client to resell at a good value because you have
Yes.
traceability, but it's not going to be enough, because, if you go on Vinted,
Mm-hmm.
you can buy, there are different categories of filters. You can buy new with the label, new without the label, used, medium, etc. So at the top, you'll have new with the electronic passport, but that's going to be expensive. But if you're looking for price, you'll go down. And the more you go down, obviously, the more you'll be exposed to counterfeits
I
and
see.
fakes.
Mm.
But
But
depends what the client's looking for.
if the whole industry moves to product passport, then we can imagine a world where on the secondhand market, you will have those with the passport, and those without passport might, then you would wonder as a consumer whether it is a legitimate product, right? But we're not, I
You
mean, it's
could,
far
and I
from,
think,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I think that's where they're heading or want to head. It does
It'll take
raise the
years.
question of the value of all the past products that don't have one.
Oh, you're right. That's
But it
absolutely
should be
right.
considered. It should be
Right.
considered because people who have bought their,
20
watch
years
like
ago.
10 years
10
ago,
years ago. Yes. No, it will not. Yeah, but we can imagine a world in 20 years where
we
you
should
will have
imagine. We
imagine.
should imagine because it's going to help us find solutions. Always
Yes.
imagine.
That's interesting. Well, thank you for that. Yes, no, it's I think, and that's what I like also about the fashion world and luxury world is they're innovating in this area, which I think is is uh, is something that is very difficult to imagine
Mhm.
in the wider world of consumer product. Although, there might be moves from
Yeah.
regulators, at least on environmental claims. They were thinking of a
Mhm.
product passport, wider product
Yeah.
passport, so you can trace the origin of a
Yeah.
product. It's manufacturing. You can vet everything, the claims. But
Yeah.
I think it's like futuristic world.
Yeah.
But maybe it will
Interestingly,
happen at some
yeah.
point.
Interestingly, the oldest watch brand in existence, or in continued existence, was Vacheron Constantin to introduce the electronic passport. They were the first.
Okay, I
So
didn't know that.
sometimes the old ladies, the
They all,
old
yes,
princesses, are the most
have great
young at
ideas.
heart.
Very cool. So now, last but not least, is my last question. If you had to sum up your work as an IP lawyer in one sentence, what would it be?
I have never lost my enthusiasm. I have always been excited, interested, passionate about working with creative people. It's a privilege to work alongside and with creative people and innovators. You realize that beyond, the designer team, that everyone is creative if you
Yes.
give them a chance, if you
Yes,
help them.
absolutely. Creativity, it requires the idea and action. Creativity is taking that step to act. And I think you're, example of that. You have ideas, but you put them into motion and action.
There's an amazing little extract from Steve Jobs who talks about that. It's really worth
Yeah.
listening to because he really makes that distinction. An idea is lovely, but it's
Yes.
nothing. Part of making it happen is also confronting it to other people, tailoring it, accepting that it's not going to look the same along the way and that perhaps the end result will be very far from your initial idea. That takes
Yes.
humility.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So on this note, I just wanted to thank you again, Olivia. It's been a pleasure. I've
Thank you.
really enjoyed learning more about you, reading your book, finding out everything that you've done. And I would encourage everyone to go to your website, read your articles, and we will also highlight some of your, upcycled art, which I think is also super creative. And thank you again for your time today. It's really been a
Well,
pleasure.
thank you, Shaz, for having me. And I feel very honored, and it was a lovely conversation.